From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later on tonight, Spirit Guides. Here's what's happening. President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has been criminally charged with deceiving a gun dealer into selling him a firearm in the first ever prosecution of a sitting president's child. The indictment filed in U.S. District Court in Delaware charged Hunter Biden with 3 criminal counts related to lying about the fact that he was using illegal drugs at the time, which would have banned him under the law from owning a firearm. My gosh. A historic strike at the Detroit 3 automakers now underway. For the first time ever, the United Auto Workers Union is striking against all big 3 automakers at once after it failed to clinch a deal on a new contract by the 11:59 p.m. deadline tonight. But the strike won't involve nearly all 150,000 union members who work at the 3 automakers walking off the job en masse. Right now, it'll affect about 13,000 workers. The workers at 3 Midwest auto plants will go out: a General Motors assembly plant in Wentzville, Missouri, a Stellantis assembly plant in Toledo, that's the old Chrysler company, and part of a Ford plant in Wayne, Michigan. We're the first to walk off the job tonight after UAW President Shawn Fain's stand-up strike strategy. Let's hope this ends quickly. Retail sales picked up in August, boosted by higher gas prices as spending on other items grew modestly. Retail sales, which are adjusted for seasonal swings but not inflation, rose 0.6% in August, according to the Commerce Department. That's a slightly faster pace than July's revised 0.5 gain and marks the 5th straight month of growth. Here's a best-selling author and the financial newsletter Strategic Financial Intelligence writer, John Truman Wolfe, with us. John, we got to get rid of this economic mess.
Hi, George. This news article kind of cuts both ways. The retail sales are up, but what's driving it, as you note, is gas prices, and those are going up because Saudi Arabia and Russia have maintained cuts in their oil production. Add to that the news item you just read, 146,000 UAW workers out for the first time in history against all 3 automakers. So I agree with you. Let's hope it ends quickly. But this rise in retail sales prices is really just driven by an increase in gas prices.
Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel here, John?
Well, I think it's going to be a rough few months, George. And, right now it's a little bit bleak. Mortgage rates, George, are at 7.5%.
Crazy.
150,000 auto workers are going to walk out. Gas prices are high. Inflation's high. So it's not a optimistic look certainly for the next few months. Hopefully, 2024 is going to give us some brighter numbers and more production.
Let's hope so. Thank you, John. John Truman Wolfe. A new study of cardiac arrest survivors suggests that almost 40% of people undergoing CPR do have memories, dreamlike experiences, or some type of perception, even when unconscious. What's more, brainwaves show signs of activity, suggesting awareness sometimes up to an hour as they are being brought back to life. Interesting. An artificial intelligence bot may be better at diagnosing patients in emergency care than real doctors, according to a study. ChatGPT performed as well or better as real-life medics when given the doctor's notes of a patient. That's amazing work. Well, here he is, Kevin Randall, with the latest in the UFO reports this week. Kevin, lots going on.
Well, that's the problem, George. There's lots going on.
And you got it for us.
I've got some of it anyway. As you know, just today, NASA released their report that suggests that improvements need to be made in tracking UFOs and for using AI to help in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The research was conducted by a panel of 16 experts from NASA who examined how the information about UFOs was collected from various government entities and the civilian world. The report did mention AARO, which has collected some 800 reports since its conception. though there is no details were provided. Current collection data, and I'm probably going to mess this up because it's somebody else's writing, and I quote, is hampered by poor sensor calibration, the lack of multiple measurements, the lack of sensor metadata, and the lack of baseline data, end quote.
You did well on that.
There's more to come. The space agency's expertise, and I quote again, should be comprehensively leveraged as part of a robust and systematic data acquisition strategy within the whole of government framework, end quote. In their first and only public meeting in May, they stressed the need for better data about UFOs, including clearer photos and videos of the incidents. In Thursday's report, the study group proposed collecting crowdsourced data about encounters from the public, including using, and I quote again, open source smartphone-based apps that simultaneously gather imaging data and other smartphone sensor metadata from multiple citizen observers worldwide, end quote. I will note here that Fran Ridge's MADAR project with node centers around the world has been attempting to collect this sort of information for years. There is a possibility through MADAR to collect multiple streams of evidence, including changes in the environment, witness testimony, and the photographic evidence that is so badly needed. The NASA report and the interest is, however, a step forward for more transparency in the search for evidence of alien visitation. And as an example of this type of crowdsourced information that NASA desires, on September 9th of this year, the witness saw a large cigar-shaped craft that was either silver or bright white. There was no visible control surfaces. The witness said he at first thought it was an aircraft and waited for the sound of jet engines, but there was dead silence. The sighting lasted 20 to 25 seconds. The witness said, and I quote, I grabbed my phone to take a picture, but it had passed out of my view, end quote. And that means that even though the witness thought to grab the phone camera, the sighting ended before the camera could come into play. In a similar case, a witness in Ironton, Ohio, sighted a UFO also on September 9th of this year. The witness was looking out the bedroom window and saw a UFO hovering at the height of the treetops. The UFO was described as a series of lights in a triangular shape. When the witness went to grab the cell phone, the UFO disappeared. Said the object didn't fly away, it just disappeared. The sighting lasted for about 20 seconds. Again, the witness thought about the cell phone camera but didn't get a chance to take a picture or make a video given the duration of the sighting. And I do want to mention that these sightings were drawn from the data on the National UFO Reporting Center website, which has been updated and is a good tool for UFO sightings research and looking for trends. And that's it for tonight, George.
All right, my friend. Thank you. That's our friend Peter Davenport's website. Does a great job for us. In a moment, Benjamin Lewin joins us. We're going to talk about his latest work, Inside Science, right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Benjamin Lewin with us, obtained his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Cambridge in England. Became the first editor of the Nature New Biology in 1971, then worked at the National Cancer Institute in 1972-3. He founded the Cell Journal in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1974 and remained editor of Cell until 1999. Cell became the top-ranked journal in life sciences, and his latest book is called Inside Science, Revolution in Biology and Its Impact. Benjamin, welcome. Looking forward to this tonight.
Thank you. Hello.
I had that story about Chat GPT out-diagnosing most doctors. What do you think of that?
Well, I've had a very interesting but different experience with ChatGPT. I used it when I was writing the book to find some references for a particular topic. So I told it what I wanted, and it gave me a list of references, and they looked pretty good. The authors were all people who publish in the field. The journals were all journals that publish papers in the field, and the titles of the articles looked exactly what I wanted. However, when I went to read the articles, none of them existed. GPT had simply imagined them. It had sort of thought, this is what these authors should have been doing, perhaps, as opposed to providing what they did do. So I would just worry a little bit about it diagnosing people in case it does the same sort of imaginative process there.
Fascinating. And is A1, in your opinion, friend or foe to science?
I think it's got great potential because it can analyze large amounts of data. It can see patterns. It can do things that human intuition would find very difficult. But there's a basic principle in science. It's worrying because there's a basic principle in science, which is that you need to be able to understand what has been done in research, how it's been done, and reproduce it. And if you have an AI program which is in a sense writing itself, modifying itself, and you don't really understand how it works, how are you going to verify the results? That's my concern about using AI in science and using it in medicine, is that if you haven't got some independent means of verification, how can you be sure it's right?
And it could be dangerously wrong then, can it?
It could be. I mean, it made up a lot of very interesting stuff. For my purposes, it was interesting, it was imaginative, but it wasn't right.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself, Benjamin.
Well, I started out intending to be a biochemist. I decided that doing research wasn't what I wanted to do because it's a very specialized activity. You spend all your time in the lab working at experiments. I was constantly criticized because I went off to the library to read and find out what else was going on. And I decided I would prefer to know about science than do it. So I became, I suppose you might say, a critic of science. I ran a journal, and I edited papers, and I wrote books. And for me, that was much more interesting because I got to see everything that was going on. Well, everything in biology anyway.
Science seems to be pushing authors to publish, to write, to publish. Is that a pretty good guess on my part?
Oh, yes. And that's not a new phenomenon. There's always been competition to publish. First person to publish gets the credit, and nobody else does. But the phrase publish or perish goes back to 1940s. And it's partly a consequence of the way science is funded and the way universities give tenure to people. If you don't publish continuously and you don't have a good record of keeping publishing, you're not going to get grants to do research. You're not going to get tenure at a university. So there's a great deal of pressure. Of course, the consequence of that is that instead of taking risks and doing research that might be interesting but that might fail, people play it safe and they do research where they're pretty sure they're going to get a reasonable result. It may not be the most interesting result, but it's safe because they can get a paper, they can get published, and they can get on with their careers. So in that sense, publish or perish is really quite damaging to science.
Benjamin, what are some of the exciting things going on in science right now?
Well, the most controversial area in the part of science I know about is epigenetics. So we have 100 years, really, of experience of saying that genetics goes to your genes. And we now know, of course, that those genes are DNA. So DNA has basically 4 components, and it's passed from parent to child, and this is responsible for heredity. But it turns out that in the process of controlling genes, you can modify one of those components. And the excitement is that sometimes it seems that those modifications may be caused by the environment. One way of responding, for example, to starvation is to modify the genes that control metabolism of food. So that in itself is quite interesting and quite exciting, but the controversy comes because some people believe, I think mistakenly, but some people believe that these modifications can be inherited. That would mean that the environment could change your genes in such a way that your children had a different response. I don't think the data are there, but a lot of people believe it, and it is probably the hottest area in biology at the moment.
Isn't it dangerous to play around with Mother Nature, Benjamin?
Well, yes and no. So we now have a technique for gene editing, the CRISPR technique, which really, in principle, lets you modify any gene at will. I think it would be dangerous if it were allowed to do that to change heredity. On the other hand, if you do it to cure a disease, that seems like it's rather a helpful thing to be able to do. So if, for example, you have, let us say, a cancer of the blood of some sort, and it's due to an aberrant gene, and you were able to replace that gene with the real gene, the correct gene, that would be a great thing. I think it's like all of these discoveries. It's what you make of it. Yes, there have to be ethical limits. There's a moratorium, in effect, on using gene editing to change heredity, and I think that's quite right and proper. But I don't think we should throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Did you see the story last week, if I got it right, that science has come up with an embryo without the mother's egg in the male sperm?
I don't see how that could happen. It doesn't.
Either do I, but I mean, they're apparently playing around with creating life from nothing.
You know, the theory of spontaneous generation was disproved 100 to 200 years ago. I don't believe that. I think it's an amusing story. It's probably a variant. People have been playing around with changing one cell type into another, and that would give you the potential to do things like, I suppose, create a female from two eggs, maybe. But I do not believe that you could create a person from a sperm. It doesn't. For one thing, it doesn't have all the parts of the cell that you would need. It sounds quite implausible. Look, one of my beefs about this sort of stuff is that people do not really understand how science works, and that makes it very easy for them to believe something that is quite implausible. People view science as some sort of black box that produces results, but they don't understand the principles of how research is done. They don't understand what the limitations are. I think you need to understand science in order to understand its limitations and see why some of the stories that pop out there are just really not likely.
Is there fraud involved in some research?
There's always been a fine line between fraud and intuition. So let us say you are doing an experiment, you get 10 sets of results. 8 of them say something which you think is a really interesting conclusion. 2 of them disagree with it. What are you going to do? What you ought to do, of course, is present all 10 results and say, this is why I don't believe the 2 that are outliers. But if you were just to publish the 8 and say, these are my results, that would be regarded these days as fraudulent. Historically, Newton fudged his results for gravitation. The results that were taken to support Einstein's theory of relativity were selected. There's a long record of people using their intuition to say these results are real, those results are not real. That goes back probably for 200 years. Today, we would regard that as a fraudulent activity. You need to present all your results and say, this is why this one is right, this is why I believe that one is wrong, and let other people form their own judgment. But fraud has been part of science in that sense.
If something major goes wrong, what would it be, do you think?
What do you mean by something major going wrong?
Playing around with the genetics and things like that, if something just really goes haywire, what could happen?
Well, I think basically you probably just have a failed experiment. I mean, we don't experiment on people, so we're not at risk that people will be damaged by an experiment, because experiments on people are very tightly controlled. You have to pass all sorts of ethics committees before you can do anything with a person. You could create a mouse that wasn't very happy, or a fruit fly that didn't work very well, but probably if you did something silly, the organism would die.
And once that does, what happens? We start over.
We start over again. That's right. It's a failed experiment. You start again.
What excites you about science, Benjamin?
What excites me? The fact that it has a value system that is self-contained and objective. What I like about science is that the data always rule at the end of the day. People can have ideas, they can have conflicts, they can have great ideas, they can have stupid ideas, but at the end of the day, you have to say the data agree with me or the data don't agree with me. I like the fact that there is, at the end of the day, some sort of objective truth. I mean, obviously, it's not absolute. Our views of what is true change. Our theories change. Newton had a theory of gravitation which ruled for 100 years, and then Einstein came with a different theory. Fine. But what I like is that at the end of the day, one is convinced by the data, as opposed to the humanities, where all ideas are equally relevant.
Well point. Benjamin, we can take a short break. We'll be right back to talk more about your work. Inside Science, next. And welcome back to Coast, George Norrie with Benjamin Lewin. We're going to take calls with Benjamin next hour here on Coast to Coast as we are talking about science. You are generally a cell biologist by trade, aren't you, Benjamin?
Yeah. I'm a molecular biologist. I'm more molecules than cells, but yes.
What have you seen over the past 20 years? Have you seen a difference in cell formation in the human body? Are we changing?
No.
Well, that's good news.
No, we are not. It would be a long haul to change cells and the organization of the body. I think you can feel fairly confident that's not happening.
Are there other countries that are ahead of us in terms of biological studies and investigations and science?
The USA is the leader in most topics, but because of the ban on work on stem cells in this country, we fell behind there. So, for example, the technique of IVF, in vitro fertilization, was all developed in Europe.
Why is there a ban?
Why was there a ban? That's the religious right. They don't believe you should be using stem cells.
Ah, okay, I understand. But
and that's political pressure affecting what gets funded. To be fair, it's only U.S. government funds that are affected. A private individual, a charity, a company can do stem cell research in this country if it wants. But it was set well back by the ban on NIH, the National Institutes of Health, supporting any research using stem cells. And we fell behind. There have been other periods when similar things have happened. At the start of what you might loosely call genetic engineering, there was a moratorium in this country, and some scientists left for Europe because they could do the work there and they couldn't do it here. So bans on research don't stop the research happening. They just stop it happening in this country, basically.
The subtitle of your book is called Revolution in Biology and Its Impact. What is that revolution?
I guess the revolution really started with the discovery that DNA was the genetic material, and it went on with a whole series of discoveries about how genes work, how they are expressed, culminating in the sequencing of the human genome in the last 20 years. So we now basically have a grasp of what an entire human genome looks like, and we had nothing like that 20 years ago. That's, a great advance.
Without being too spiritual, I think the human body is magnificent. I mean, we've got 2 eyes to see, 2 ears to hear, a nose to breathe, a mouth to open, talk, and eat. I mean, who would come up with something so magnificent as that?
Well, that's evolution. But you have to ask yourself, our DNA is 99% the same as a chimpanzee, but we are very different from chimpanzees. That's, part of the great thing to find out is what makes us human.
Do you add spirituality into some of your work, or do you try to stay away from that?
I try to be objective about science, which means, spirituality is all very well, but it's a belief system, and it's a different belief system from science. I don't think the two go very well together. You can be spiritual on one hand, you can do science on another hand, but mixing the two is not something I would like to do.
Benjamin, what is our next level? What's the next step we take?
I would say the great challenge now is to understand consciousness. What makes us conscious? How do we know who we are? That's the great challenge.
You think we'll ever get answers to that? Because that's a perplexing question.
Well, I think opinion is split on whether it will ever be possible to do that, analyze that or not. Some people feel that in the end of the day, consciousness will just be a matter of analyzing brain function. Other people feel that there is some element to it that we are incapable of analyzing and we will never know.
It is exciting. It truly is. And
I don't actually have a decided view on it myself. It's a great question. If we make an AI program that gets more and more advanced, cleverer and cleverer, will it ever achieve consciousness? Can you be conscious if you're not human? That's a sort of subsidiary question, but a great one.
At what age did you get interested in this?
In science, I suppose in my teens.
That's a good age for that. What are the schools doing today to keep up with things?
Well, they're not.
Oh, boy.
One of the problems is that the way science is taught these days is very factual. It's just a massive facts to be learned, and I think that puts people off who might be interested. Look, people sometimes think science or scientists are arrogant because they believe in data, and, once they're convinced that the data are right, they don't, it's not open to discussion. But the fact is, science is not like that. Science is actually a highly subversive system because everything is subject to question. And that's one of the things I like about it. There's nothing that's fixed. Everything is subject to question. You come up with better data than someone else, then the scientific view will change.
The journal that you were the editor for 25 years, Cell, became a top-ranked journal in life sciences. What was it about? How did it read?
Well, I started Cell because if you go back to the 1970s, science was a very sort of arcane pursuit. And if you had a really interesting discovery, you couldn't really publish it very effectively. You could write a short note and publish it reasonably quickly here being 3, 4, 5 months. But the short note wouldn't have enough details for other people really to see what you had done. It would be a sort of claim. I have established something really interesting, and later I will provide the details to explain what it was and why it's real. And then those details will be published maybe 1, 2 years later. I didn't think science should work like that. I thought we should have the principle that if you publish a hot claim, you support it right there and then. And we started Cell to make it possible for people to publish stuff quickly and completely. And I have to say this was very successful. Of course, it's now been overtaken by events. In the digital world, a scientific paper can be published in a few days. But when we started Cell and started doing this in a few weeks, it was quite revolutionary.
Benjamin, what do you think of genetically modified foods, putting pig valves in humans for valves and things like that? Is that dangerous, or the interchanging important?
It should not be dangerous. I mean, look, people get very excited about genetically modified crops, but all crops have been genetically modified. They've been bred and selected over a long period of time. The difference with doing genetic modification by modern means is you can do it much more quickly. In principle, basically we're speeding up the selection of crops or animals or whatever. Yes, I think you don't want to do silly stuff, but I think generally speaking, if it's handled responsibly, it should make it possible for us to feed people better, to treat medical conditions better, and it should be an advance.
You think somewhere there's a mad scientist in his laboratory tinkering away at things?
Well, the mad scientist goes back to Frankenstein and so on.
Yeah.
Probably not. There will always be someone who is prepared to go past the ethical boundaries that other people are respecting. There was a scientist in China who did some genetic engineering to make it impossible for people to get AIDS by eliminating the receptor that does it. He ended up in prison. It was felt to be a step that shouldn't have been taken. Could there be someone somewhere doing something silly? Yes, of course there could be. But, almost all science these days is funded by the government or by large charitable institutions who keep a pretty good eye on what people are doing. It would be sort of difficult to go really off-piste and do something that most people will consider to be unethical. I don't worry about mad scientists very much. What
do you think of cloning?
Cloning animals, cloning people?
People.
We do not want to clone people. It's been generally agreed that is not something to be tried. Incidentally, there is a technical problem with it anyway. You can clone animals, right? Dolly the sheep was the first.
Dolly the sheep, sure.
You can clone all sorts of animals, but they tend to have defects. They tend to be problems with them, and you certainly wouldn't want to do that with people. So even aside from the ethical issue, should you clone people, the practical issue is that you wouldn't want to do it because you would probably be breeding people who had some sort of problem.
I mean, I sadly see the day one day where there'll be someone who's got the capability of cloning, and some parents, let's say, who have lost their little child, have part of their DNA still around, maybe a strand of hair or something, and they bring it to this doctor and they want their little boy back or something.
Well, technically that might become possible at some point, but there is an agreement, and I think, in fact, it's been passed into law in many countries now, that you cannot clone people.
I would agree with that. I mean, why would you want to do that in the first place?
It's generally agreed it would not be a good idea, ethically, practically, by any sort of standard you want to apply to it.
But conceivably possible, right?
Conceivably possible, sure.
Interesting.
Well, look, if you can clone cats, dogs, monkeys, in principle you have to be able to apply it to any organism.
What about trying to create the woolly mammoth again or something like that?
Oh, it would be great, wouldn't it? I think it'd be really nice to have a woolly mammoth running around. I'm not sure. I mean, there are impediments to recreating ancient animals. You would have to start with something like an elephant and modify it. Mm-hmm. I think it would be very difficult to do. Is it impossible? No. Is it probable? Not very likely.
What did you think of Jurassic Park, the movie? Conceivable?
Not really.
I mean, that would be unbelievable to make another Tyrannosaurus Rex or something like that.
Bring back the dinosaurs. Well, I don't think there's any dinosaur remnants out there that would let you recreate their DNA anyway. I mean, all we've got are fossils. So I think that's really unlikely.
Benjamin, are we changing naturally through evolution, even though it takes long time to do it? Are we changing?
It's a really good question. You would think so, but I would imagine that the size of the population probably means no. I'm not aware of any evolutionary changes. I mean, we are changing in the sense we are, for example, bigger, taller than we were 100 years ago.
Right. And we live longer.
Yeah, and we live longer. But it's an open question whether the major improvement in life expectancy came in the 19th century, but it's a fair question whether that was more due to medical advance or more due to improvements in public sanitation, good supplies of water that wasn't contaminated and so on. We're getting taller, bigger, healthier, we live longer, but none of that is really evolutionary. It's due to changes in society, medicine, and so on.
What about efforts to keep us young through biology? Is that ethical?
Ethical, yes, but we don't really understand aging at all at the moment. We've got glimpses of things to do with aging, but none of them seem to be absolutely critical. We don't quite understand it. I think what the most you can hope for is that science will pay off in medical advances that will let people live longer and let them be healthier as they live longer. But are we going to sort of achieve very long lifespans or immortality? No, I wouldn't think so.
Is your book available now for people, Inside Science?
The book is available. It was published a couple of days ago, and it's around on Amazon and hopefully in bookshops. All
right, we're going to take a short break, Benjamin, and come back and take phone calls with you in our final hour with Benjamin Lewin right here on Coast to Coast. The name of his book is called Inside Science, and we will be right back with your calls.